So Natasha Kirkham is our next presenter. She comes to us from University of London, and she will be talking about the science of learning and what it can tell us about the reality of learning.
Yes, hopefully. Thank you.
Hopefully.
So we're going to take a little bit of a shift in what we're talking about today because I am going to move us back from adult consumers all the way to babies and children. And what I'm going to talk about today is going to be about how babies learn, how children learn, and specifically how babies' attention is deployed from the very beginning. A lot of work is done in businesses and in thinking about consumers in looking at what babies like. Obviously, what we want is for the parents to buy the things, but what is interesting is how babies are reacting to their world. So how do we create the products that are going to make the babies happy? I will leave that to you guys, and I am going to talk about how babies actually respond to their environment, and then I'm going to get a little further onto my topic and talk about some work I've done in looking at how we are educating children and what it means. I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotations, which is, "Development occurs in the middle of things." And this is the similar idea that we had yesterday when people were talking about context. I remember the Asahi, is that right? Asahi? I want to say this properly. The Asahi talk in which we were discussing the context of drinking beer. Obviously, I'm not going to discuss children drinking beer, but the idea of context is very important when you think about development. Babies and children do not grow up in a vacuum. They grow up surrounded by noise and chaos and mess and everything. And so while we can find out a lot about what goes on with babies through our laboratory experiments, and I've done plenty of them, what is actually really interesting is how they respond in the middle of things, in the context of real life. So I'll start today by talking about what we actually mean when we say learning, because we all have slightly different definitions. And then I'm going to talk about some work I've done looking at multisensory cues in the classroom. I will explain this in much more detail as we go. So our perspective of learning is that it is the acquisition of representations that support adaptive behavior. And sometimes in basic neuroscience, learning is just equated with memory. But for learning from an educational perspective, from a teacher's perspective, can be very, very different. We're thinking about a diverse set of views, often grounded in what we call constructivist ideas of learner-driven acquisition. So successful learning will draw on all of these different opportunities that the learner has before them. And it is grounded in things such as interactive group work and the student feeling as if they own their own work. So it has a very different perspective. As you know, science is about causal mechanisms, not just classification. So I am a developmental psychologist, a developmental scientist, and what I care about is understanding the causal mechanisms of behaviors as they unfold both developmentally, so across age groups, and in real time. And I'm going to concentrate on the real time stuff today. Some of the questions we ask when we talk about learning or attention is, how does it break down or how does it fail? So a lot of times we are quite interested in the mistakes that children make. How can learning strategies be modified? How can failures be rectified? So explain this individual variability in learning. We want to know why it takes place in certain ways and not in others. Why does it take place at certain times or in certain contexts and not in others? So why are you picking up information in one place but ignoring it in another? So this is incredibly important for how development is occurring. So why is understanding mechanisms important for education? Well, quite clearly it's important because we are teaching the future, as we know. And it is incredibly important to understand the mechanisms behind attention and learning so that we can understand how these little people develop and how they understand their world around them. We use observation and experimentation, which we've talked about already in this conference. Neurological and biological constraints are very, very important when we're coming up with these ideas. And computational modeling is something we're very interested in. Okay, so this is sort of a broad overview of the kind of questions I ask and the things I think about. And now I'm going to get into some details about some of the work that I've done with attention. So my background, looking at learning in babies. So this here is a few examples of some of the studies I've done. And what it is talking about is how infants pick up on patterns in their environment. I use a method called eye tracking. So you can see that baby's little eye wandering around. And you can see a little crosshair that's running around, picking up on where those shapes are occurring. And there's a nice little pattern there. And what we found through many different experiments is that babies' eye movements get faster and faster as they pick up on the pattern. Much better than adults, who quite frankly are quite poor at this. Babies do, this is all babies do. They look and they listen. There is nothing else going on at this stage. If you're 6 months old, like this young lad, then that's what you're doing. You're just watching what's happening around you. There's not a lot of top-down information filtering through. You don't have a goal in mind. You're not thinking about what you're going to do next and who you're going to text. You're just watching. And so you get much better at picking up on the patterns in your environment. Pattern prediction is essential. It's what helps us learn language. It's what helps us learn how to act in our physical world. It is absolutely everything that makes us excited about predicting the outcome of a movie, predicting the outcome of a sports event. So pattern prediction is something that is not only integral to learning, but it's very satisfying. And babies do it because they like it. With my student Rachel Wu, who's now at UC Riverside, we asked the question about, can we get babies to choose what to look at? And even before they are understanding language, so this is again with 6-month-old babies, we asked whether or not we can get someone to tell them to do something. So I'll show you a little video. It's from a documentary, so there's some talking over it. But effectively, we have a lovely young woman in the middle of the screen who tells the baby where to look. There's 2 equally attractive events occurring, but the baby is going to look where the person tells her to.
The blue dot on the screen shows where baby Harrison is looking.
So the blue dot is the eye
corner
track.
the adult looks at.
Hi, baby. Look at this.
He also quickly learns that this tune means look at the bottom corner, even after the adult has disappeared from view. It's a clear example of biased learning.
So that is an example of teaching a baby to do something, and it happens almost immediately. 30 seconds of watching that lovely face tell you where to look, and the baby has learnt something about that event and where to look. The next thing we did was to sort of set it up so that the babies were having things pitted against them. It wasn't quite as easy. So now, in one of the conditions, which is on the far right of the screen, the face is not reliable. Sometimes it looks where it should, sometimes it doesn't. And in the left side of the screen was an event in which we wanted the baby to look at something in order to get a reward, and I'll show you videos of this so you can understand it. But sometimes it was the place we wanted them to look was not the exciting place. And so this was making them move away from their preferential attention. So let me explain this. This is with Kristen Tummeltshammer, who's now at Brown. And so what you're going to see in the next video is some eye tracking. 2 shapes, both look equally exciting. One of them they have to look at in order to get a nice little reward. The reward is seeing a video. It's from the UK. It's a baby show that they all love to death, and they'll watch it all the time. So they need to look at the star to see the fun show, which if you're a parent in the UK, drives you crazy. So these are both 6-month-olds and 8-month-olds. And the method was that at the beginning of this study, we showed them both the star and the circle, and we just let them look. That was our pretest. And then at the end of the study, we showed them the star of the circle and looked to see if they had a preference for looking at either one of these. And what we found was indeed both our 6-month-olds and our 8-month-olds showed a much more looking to the star after being sort of conditioned for this reward than they had at the beginning. But now what we do is we offer them the same exact choice. This is look at the star, get the reward. But rather cruelly, we give the blue circle a great big smiling happy face. It is incredibly difficult for a baby to look away. They really love that video, but they really love the smiling face. God love them. They just really want to look. Okay, so this is what we find. Our 6-month-olds, bless them, never ever show any learning. They just look at the face. They look at the face before, they look at the face after, they don't learn. Our 8-month-olds show an increase in looking to the star in their post-test. They all look at the face more. It's a face. Faces are fun. Always going to happen. But they've struggled enough and they've moved their attention enough that we've managed to give them something. So by 8 months of age, we can shift their preference if we give them something rewarding. We can teach them something that's not just an instinctual attention grabber. Okay, the last one from the baby set is the unreliable faces. So what we did here was we did exactly the same thing as in the little documentary you saw, and we showed these babies a lovely person who was going to ask them to look in one corner of the screen, and sometimes there'd be something there and sometimes there wouldn't, but the idea is that one face was always reliable. If she was looking somewhere and something occurred, she was always right, and the second person was not reliable. So the question is, do you learn quickly? These are 8-month-old babies.
Wow, look!
This is our reliable face. Baby has learned very quickly to follow her gaze.
Wow, look!
Even when there's nothing there, they're happy to go have a look.
Wow, look!
Okay? What was amazing about this was that it was 40 seconds of experience with this reliable face, and they were happy to follow her anywhere, even to sounds they'd never heard of or never heard before in this experiment. With our, sorry, the Wi-Fi keeps popping up again. Okay, here we go.
Look.
Unreliable face. Oh, that's not good.
Wow, look!
They immediately distrust her.
Wow, look! Wow, look!
And quite interestingly, she was one of our research assistants, when they saw her afterwards, they did not like her, which really distressed her. But anyway, this happened like that. 40 seconds, again, of watching this unreliable face, and they were not interested. They knew that she was not going to help out. We had a whole series of different conditions in this study, but I'll just show you this one, the results from this particular one. We had what was called a test trial, in which the face looked at a place where an event had happened before, but now was empty. And we had a generalization trial where the face looked somewhere where nothing had ever happened before. And what we saw was that if it was a reliable face, oh yeah, oh my God, it was a reliable face, both test and generalization, they were happy to look to where the face turned. Now, the reason that you get this low proportion of looking is there's a face in the middle of the screen. So they do look at the face. So this was a really intense amount of looking at the area. Unreliable face, nope, no test, no generalization, no nothing, they're done. In fact, interestingly, they didn't really even look at the stuff. They just looked at the face, presumably judging her. No, probably not. Okay. So this is my background. This was my interest in sort of how learning was occurring. So how you pit different ideas against each other. And in many conversations with people over the course of my career, one thing kept coming up, and this is a leap away from babies to school-age children. I had primary school-age children at the time, and I kept getting asked, well, if you know all this about attention, so what do you think about the fact that they're doing a lot in schools to grab attention? Stuff on the walls, people talking, lots of singing and dancing. I'm not familiar with primary school in Japan, of course, but in England, everything is taught using something called multimodal. So you don't just learn the alphabet, you sing it, you have blocks with the letters on it, you build it. In my particular kid's school, they had a little rap that they did to learn the alphabet, which was awesome. There's dancing, there's lots of stuff that goes on. And the whole idea is based on some stuff that was done with infant research that said, if you have lots of modalities together at the same time, learning is increased. Don't just show the face, show the sound as well. Don't just show that little object that you saw, have it moving around, have it singing. Multimodal, multisensory. Turns out no one had ever done any studies in academia to actually ask whether or not this worked. So you have a classroom, it's filled with noise, there's lots of people, there's talking, there's yelling, there's stuff going on outside. I don't know what your schools are like, but in London you can hear traffic outside, sometimes ambulances, etc. And yes, children are very sensitive to multiple modalities, but what does that do? And in fact, what it's done in the education sector is create a whole series of ideas that are probably not true. So multimodality suddenly becomes learning styles, and that is a problem in and of itself. It becomes, we have a smart screen in our classroom, we're multimodal. Problem solving versus kinesthetic versus technology, well, that's multimodal. And strictly by definition, that is multimodal. But it's completely different from classroom to classroom. So what we did was we decided to run some studies to see if learning using different modalities was actually useful. Now, this doesn't have to just be applied to the classroom. This can be applied to anything, to gaming, to any kind of television learning, etc. The idea is that just because you have more stuff coming at you from different directions, does it necessarily mean that it's better for learning? Oh, this is an ad from a school in my neighborhood. Why is it so loud? We're learning. And I just thought, that's just stupid. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But nonetheless, right, there's the idea behind it. Okay. So, do children benefit from information that comes from two modalities? Does this change across age? And what does this mean for education? Little bit of a spoiler alert. The data is very messy, as you can probably imagine, but I'll go through it quite gently. So this is our task. It's called the Multisensory Category Learning Task, or for the kids, the aliens task. And the idea is you ask the child, here's an alien, and this alien looks, you can see him up there, he's very cute. There he is. It's a computer game. And he has either lots of legs or not lots of legs. He has lots of stripes or not lots of stripes. And he has different ways of speaking. He has a little growly voice or a high voice. It's a category task. We just say to the kids, every time an alien comes up, I want you to help me find his home. And they just click on either this spaceship or this spaceship. Unbeknownst to them, there is actually a category here. All the guys with many legs go here, for example, and few legs go there. And the idea is over time, they will learn this. We don't tell them, it's incidental learning. Once they get 6 right in a row, then the game stops. Here's some of the sounds. Or not. Hang on. Let me see if, oh, you know what, it doesn't matter, you'll see it in a second. Here's the actual task. We ran this with 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and 10-year-olds. And importantly, we ran it with 3 conditions. So either the way the aliens sounded was what determined what spaceship they lived in, the way they looked was what determined what spaceship they lived in, or both. So this is the multimodal condition. And this is the experiment.
Yeah.
And they would press the button, and then it would move to where it was supposed to live.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
After 6 right, they had finished and they had won. So the idea was that they pressed a button based on where they thought it lived. And regardless of whether they were right or wrong, the little alien went to his correct place. So they found out pretty quickly if they had done it correctly or incorrectly. This is a fairly typical way of running a categorization task. And we thought, well, multimodal is best. So the ones that had more information, both the auditory and the visual information, were going to do better across the across every single age group. And it wasn't true. What we found was that actually the only children that benefited from multimodal information were our youngest age group, the 5-year-olds. By the time kids were at the end of primary school age in the UK, so 10 to 11 years of age, auditory information was the only thing that worked. It did not matter what these things looked like. If they sounded differently, they could do it. They were learning much better with the auditory information. This does not mean they had an auditory learning style, because that's not a thing, which I can get into later if you want to know. It meant that they were attending to the auditory information and only that. Whereas the little ones, our little reception kindergarten kids, they were the ones that really seemed to need more information. And in fact, studies I've done with babies shows this exact same trend. The younger you are, the more support you need. If you're a little baby, if you're a little kid, and you need to learn something, you need to have your attention drawn somewhere, something needs to be made important to you, then having more information is better. But as you get older, this is not necessarily the case. This is just to say that the reaction time, how long it took them to make the choices, also speaks to this trend. So you spend much less time, you're much faster, much slower at making your choices when you're putting more effort into it and you're spending more time, and then you're right. So it's the sort of, it's a payoff that we see a lot in this type of, these types of studies. Okay. All right, so the summary for this is that only the youngest age group showed any benefit from our informative and redundant audiovisual cues. They required fewer trials to reach the learning threshold in the multisensory condition than in either of the 2 unisensory conditions. And as I mentioned before, by 10 years of age, actually they were just using the auditory information. So the usefulness of multisensory information learning is far from clear-cut. And I think what this does point out nicely, and why I chose to present it to this particular audience, is that it doesn't always serve to take the information that we get from a lot of the big, flashy scientific experiments and just think that this is the way to go. So yes, babies are very good at integrating across modalities in extremely quiet, well-controlled laboratory experiments. If you get out into the real world, everything changes. You now have an amazing amount of context to deal with. And it's very important to think about this when you're actually trying to make that leap from science to applied business or anything applied, particularly education for myself. Okay, I am going to end here with just a few little ads for my students who are continuing to do this kind of work. And the two that are really interesting to me right now is thinking about how noise affects learning. And we have found that actually noisy atmospheres can be very, very difficult and problematic, particularly in infancy, and really does change how attention is developing. I would very much like to say thank you to my lab and all of the fabulous babies that come in and the people that think it's okay to fund me. And thank you so much for inviting me to this. It's wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. That was really interesting data. Do we have questions from the audience? Sure, go ahead.
Joe can always ask a question.
Yes.
Yeah. At the risk of asking too many questions.
No, please.
That was really fascinating. I was thinking as you were talking that, HR makes me attend a lot of things that I need to learn. And I'm sure it's for my
the
own
unconscious
good.
bias thing? Did you do that?
Yeah, among others. And of course, it's been a long time since I've been an infant. So I'm just wondering, to what extent can you take some of these kind of lessons and say, well, if you're going to be doing a corporate learning thing or just whatever it is it better to do a kind of like what Janet was talking and have us not able to access our phones to limit distractions or do it in a quieter environment? Or can these things still work for us, at my very non-infant stage?
Yes. Do you want me to? Yeah, yes.
I'd love you to take that further.
Just go further. Yes, absolutely. In fact, one of the interesting things that we have found is that there's a real difference between how children learn and how adults learn, and that's really a generation thing. So if you put kids in a room with music that has lyrics, so voices, they are quite happy and they will sit and they will actually engage in the information they're supposed to be learning. If there's no lyrics, they get fussy because it's unusual to them, it's unfamiliar, where it's the opposite for adults. So a pleasant symphony in the background is very conducive to learning because we can block it out. The minute there's anything to do with language, then because we have so much top-down filtering, we cannot do anything. So things like screens and phones is a massive, massive thing that we talk about a lot in developmental psychology, of course. And I'm not going to get into the big quagmire or big muddy pit that is thinking about screens and kids. But I think putting your phone down in order to concentrate is an incredibly good idea. And in fact, having rooms that don't have a ton of stuff all around is also very good. So you're more likely to concentrate in this room than in a room that had posters everywhere. We just are very bad at pulling our attention away from salient objects. I don't know about HR and their particular things, but yes.
Can you say anything about the difference between initial learning versus updating your learning? So you learn that this face is a reliable predictor, that where they look is interesting. Are there sort of things that can be said about infants versus children versus adults in terms of when you have to update that and the unreliable looker becomes a reliable looker, and how long it takes them to update that kind of?
That's a really good question. Thank you so much. So with babies, it takes quite a while. So when we tried to show them lovely Katerina as the reliable face, they were having none of it. Now, we did it right away, and they were not having anything to do with that. If we bring them back in a day later, all bets are off, that's fine. They don't hold grudges, right? But children is a little harder. So if you set up a situation where someone has failed to be reliable or trustworthy, they will hold that grudge for much longer. So you can bring them back in the next week and they still think, oh, no. You said that was going to be chocolate and it was broccoli. I'm not sitting with him. And they will keep that in mind. This is a working memory thing, of course, yeah. But babies are fast to pick it up, but they're also quite easy to let go. Yes, please, Nicola.
Yeah.
Ooh, I want to answer that. Yeah.
So, following on from Matthew's question, do you find any evidence for judgment bias in that once you're unreliable, it's then difficult to become reliable, whereas if you can start reliable but lose that reputation more quickly?
Yes. Yeah, that's brilliant, yes. I haven't done that study myself, but I have read stuff about that. Yes, it is much easier, it's much harder to regain your reliability in the eyes of the baby or the child than to lose it. Absolutely, and it's really interesting to look at, so yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for interesting talk. So my question is that could 6 or 8 months babies can focus on the task or pay attention to the task in this experiment? Because I think it's a little bit difficult for the babies to focus on the task. Somebody crying or somebody can't watch the screen or something. So how do you deal with that?
Oh, to make them focus? Well, in the experimental tasks, what we do is we make sure that there's nobody else around. They sit on mom or dad's lap. It's quiet, it's dark. The only thing they have is the screen in front of them to look at. If we do these experiments in homes, you're absolutely right. They look at half the stuff that we want them to look at. So actually attention in a valid setting, by which I mean in somewhere where they would normally be, in their home, in a daycare, looks very, very different. But the one thing we know that no matter where they are, no matter how much distraction is going on, if there is a face and it's smiling at them, then that gets all their attention. Eye contact, smiling, speaking, direct kind of contact, that drags attention immediately. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, makes sense.
You're very welcome.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.